The dust devils danced across the Arizona desert like restless spirits, swirling red earth into miniature tornadoes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Eleanor Roosevelt, not the future First Lady, but a stubborn young woman who shared the name and perhaps the spirit, squinted against the afternoon sun, her hand shading her eyes as she surveyed the vast expanse before her. The year was 1878, and the frontier town of Copper Creek lay behind her, a collection of wooden buildings and false-fronted stores that pretended at civilization while the wilderness pressed in from all sides. She had arrived 3 weeks ago, fleeing the suffocating expectations of Boston society. Her father, a railroad magnate, had been apoplectic when she announced her intention to document the frontier through her sketches and writings. No daughter of mine will gallivant through Indian territory like some common adventuress. He had thundered, but Eleanor had inherited his iron will along with his fortune. And here she stood, her split riding skirt dusty and her spirit soaring with the hawks overhead. The morning had begun innocuously enough. She'd set out from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house with her sketchpad and watercolors, determined to capture the stark beauty of the mesas that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. The innkeeper had warned her not to venture too far. Apache territory starts where the town ends. Miss, they may be at peace now, but peace is a fragile thing in these parts. Eleanor had nodded politely and ignored the advice entirely. What was the point of coming to the frontier if she was going to cower behind town boundaries? She'd hired a sure-footed mare from the livery stable and rode out past the last ramshackle miner's cabin, following a dry creek bed that wound between towering saguaro cacti. Now, several hours later, she sat on a flat rock outcropping, her paintbrush moving across the paper in quick, confident strokes. The landscape was unlike anything she'd seen in her 22 years, brutal and beautiful in equal measure. The rocks glowed orange and red in the slanted light, and the sparse vegetation spoke of survival against all odds. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the horse approaching until its shadow fell across her paper. Eleanor's heart lurched as she looked up. The man sitting astride the paint horse was unlike any she'd encountered in town. His skin was bronzed by sun and heritage, his black hair long and bound with a strip of leather. He wore a combination of traditional Apache dress and practical frontier clothing, leather leggings, a cotton shirt, and a vest adorned with silver conchos. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark as obsidian and utterly unreadable, as they studied her with the same intensity she'd been applying to the landscape. For a long moment, neither spoke. Eleanor's hand had frozen mid-brush stroke, a droplet of cerulean blue trembling at the brush's tip. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability alone, miles from town, facing a warrior whose people had every reason to distrust hers. Yet she felt no fear, only a curious sense of recognition, as if she'd been waiting to meet this man without knowing it. "You're far from your people," he said finally. His English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "So are you," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with her steady voice. She gestured to the empty landscape around them. "Unless the rocks and cacti count as company." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "The desert is never empty to those who know how to see." He dismounted with fluid grace, and Eleanor noticed the rifle in the scabbard on his saddle, the knife at his belt. Yet his movements were unhurried, non-threatening. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of sage and leather, the wild smell of the desert itself. "You paint," he observed, nodding at her watercolors. "Why do you try to capture what cannot be held?" Eleanor looked down at her work, a pale imitation of the grandeur before them. "Because beauty deserves to be remembered, even imperfectly. The desert does not care for memory. It exists only in the now." He moved around to see her painting better, maintaining a respectful distance. "You see with clear eyes, but your hand betrays fear." "Fear?" Eleanor bristled slightly. "I'm not afraid. Not of me, of the truth." He pointed to her painting. You soften the edges, make gentle what is harsh. The desert is not kind. Why do you lie to your paper? The criticism stung because it was accurate. Eleanor had been unconsciously civilizing the landscape, making it more palatable, less threatening. Perhaps I paint what I wish to see. Then you will never truly see it all. He turned to leave, and Eleanor felt an unexpected urgency. Wait, what's your name? He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Names have power. I don't give mine to strangers who paint lies. Then I'll have to call you something, Eleanor said, her natural stubbornness asserting itself. How about Franklin? You seem like a Franklin to me. For the first time, his stern expression cracked. His lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Franklin is not an Apache name. Franklin Pierce was president. It's a perfectly respectable name. You're president. The words carried weight, a reminder of the divide between them. I am called Geronimo by some, though it is not my true name. Eleanor's eyes widened. She'd heard the name whispered in town Geronimo, the legendary Apache leader. But this man seemed too young. And besides, wasn't Geronimo still fighting in Mexico? You're not the Geronimo. No, but I knew him before he chose the warpath. I chose differently. There was something in his voice, not regret exactly, but a complex emotion she couldn't name. My path is my own. And what path is that? He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, one that doesn't cross with yours. Eleanor Roosevelt of Boston. She started. How did you? Your name is sewn into your saddlebags. Your horse bears the livery stable's mark. You stay at the boarding house that serves tea at 4 o'clock. His dark eyes held hers. I know more than you think, and that is why I tell you this: go back to your people. Paint your soft pictures. Find a man who will give you children and a house with glass windows. Forget the desert. Why? The word came out more plaintively than she intended. He turned his horse, pausing to deliver words that would echo in her mind for days to come. Because I can't love you, and you look at me like a woman who believes in impossible things. Before Eleanor could respond, to deny, to question, to protest the presumption, he was gone, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust that the wind quickly claimed. She sat frozen, her painting forgotten, struggling to process what had just happened. The sheer arrogance of him. To assume she had any interest in... And yet... She looked down at her painting with new eyes, seeing what he had seen: the dishonesty in her soft washes, the fear in her timid strokes. With a sudden decision, she tore the page from her book and let the wind take it. Tomorrow, she would try again. Tomorrow, she would paint the truth. The ride back to town seemed longer than the ride out. The shadows lengthened, turning the familiar landmarks strange. Eleanor's mind churned with questions. Who was this man who wore Geronimo's name like armor? What had he meant about choosing a different path? And why her cheeks burned at the thought? Why had he felt the need to warn her off when she'd given no indication of romantic interest? She stabled her horse and walked back to the boarding house, where Mrs. Henderson was waiting on the porch, her face creased with worry. Lord have mercy, child. I was about to send Samuel out looking for you. You can't go riding alone like that. This isn't Boston. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, Eleanor said, though the words felt less certain than they had this morning. That's what they all say, until they aren't. The older woman's voice softened. Come inside. Supper's waiting, and you look like you've seen a ghost. Perhaps she had, Eleanor thought, a ghost of possibilities that could never be. The dining room was full of the usual collection drummers passing through, a surveyor from the railroad company, 2 spinster schoolteachers heading further west, and Marcus Twain, no relation to the writer. He insisted, though he told stories just as well. Eleanor picked at her stew, half listening to Marcus regale the table with tales of silver strikes and claim jumpers. Heard there was Apache sign spotted near Skeleton Canyon, the surveyor said, lowering his voice as if the walls might have ears. Army sending extra patrols out. Apaches aren't the problem, Marcus said, gesturing with his fork. It's the ones that pretend to be civilized you gotta watch out for. They learn our ways, speak our language, then use it against us. That's enough of that talk, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. We have a treaty. Has been peace for near on 2 years now. Peace, Marcus snorted. Tell that to the Conway family. Found them. I said enough. The landlady's voice brooked no argument. There are ladies present. Eleanor excused herself early, claiming fatigue, in her small room under the eaves. She sat by the window and watched the desert turn purple in the twilight. Somewhere out there. He was watching the same sunset. She was sure of it. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Father, the frontier continues to provide ample material for my work. You would hardly recognize your daughter I ride astride. I dine with miners and merchants, and I am learning to see with clearer eyes each day. Do not worry for my safety. I am well protected by the redoubtable Mrs. Henderson, who guards her female boarders like a dragon guards gold. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. How could she explain what had happened today? How could she describe the feeling of being seen, truly seen by a stranger who had looked at her art and found it wanting? Who had looked at her and found... what? A danger, apparently. Something to warn off with harsh words. She crumpled the letter and started again, this time to her younger sister. Dearest Charlotte, you would laugh to see me now, dressed in divided skirts and boots that have seen better days. But oh, the freedom of it, no calling cards, no tedious teas, no discussions of wedding china and charitable committees. I wake with the sun and retire when I please. I am becoming myself at last, though I am not yet sure who that person might be. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound raised goosebumps on her arms. The desert was calling, and something in her answered. She thought of his words. The desert is never empty to those who know how to see. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go out again. Not to the same place she wasn't foolish enough to court another encounter, but somewhere she could practice seeing truly. She would paint the harshness along with the beauty, the death that fed life, the terrible majesty of survival. And if she happened to scan the horizon more carefully, if she listened more closely to the whisper of wind through stone, well, that was only prudent. A woman alone needed to be aware of her surroundings. The next morning brought clouds, unusual for the season. Eleanor dressed carefully, split skirt, sturdy boots, her father's old cavalry hat that she'd appropriated before leaving Boston. She packed her supplies methodically: water, hardtack, her Colt pocket revolver, a scandal in Boston, a necessity here, and her art supplies. Mrs. Henderson caught her at the door. You're going out again? Yes. Same direction? Eleanor hesitated. No, I thought I'd try the Northern Valley today. I heard there are petroglyphs there. The older woman studied her shrewdly. You met someone yesterday? It wasn't a question. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't know what you mean. Child, I've been on this frontier for 20 years. I know the look of a woman who's encountered something that's shaken her foundations. She sighed. Be careful. This land, it changes people, and some bridges, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Eleanor left without answering, but the warning followed her out into the gray morning. The Northern Valley was closer to town, supposedly safer, but she found herself looking over her shoulder more than once. Every shadow could hide a rider. Every distant sound might be hoofbeats. She found the petroglyphs as promised ancient symbols carved into the rock face, their meanings lost to time. She set up her easel and began to work, this time holding nothing back. She painted the violence of the landscape, the way the rocks seemed to bleed rust, the skeletal reach of dead vegetation, the patient circling of buzzards in the clouded sky. "Better." The voice came from directly behind her. Eleanor's hand jerked, leaving a streak of umber across her sky. She spun around to find him standing there as if materialized from the stone itself. "How do you do that?" she demanded, heart racing. "You make noise like a cavalry regiment. Easy to avoid, easy to approach." He studied her painting with the same intense focus as before. "You learn quickly." "I had a harsh critic." "Truth is not harsh. It simply is." He moved to stand beside her, and she caught that sage and leather scent again. "These marks," he gestured to the petroglyphs. "My people say they tell of a great battle, long before the white man came. Warriors who fought for water rights. And did they resolve it? Everyone died. The water dried up. The desert reclaimed all." He delivered this cheerfully enough that it took Eleanor a moment to process the bleakness of it. "That's terrible." "That's truth. Fighting over what cannot be owned leads only to death." His dark eyes flicked to her face. "Why did you come back?" "This is a different valley entirely. I had no expectation of seeing you again." "Lies." The word was soft, almost amused. "You hoped, just as I watched for you, though I told myself I wouldn't." Eleanor's breath caught. "Then why?" "Because hope is dangerous." He turned away, gazing out over the valley. "I am Franklin, as you named me. Franklin Pierce, the President." The mockery was gentle but clear. "And I cannot love you." "You said that yesterday. I haven't asked you to." "No, but you will." He said it with such certainty that Eleanor wanted to throw her paintbrush at him. The arrogance. Not arrogance, experience. He faced her again, and for the first time, she saw the shadows in his eyes, the weight he carried. "I loved a woman once. She died because of that love, because I was weak, because I chose her over duty. My chief cast me out, and I deserved it. I wander now between worlds, belonging to neither. I won't make that mistake again." The pain in his voice cut through Eleanor's indignation. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was the price of wisdom." He moved back toward her painting. "You're still afraid, but less. Good. Fear keeps you alive, but too much fear keeps you from living." They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, looking at her work. "Finally," Eleanor asked, "will you tell me your real name, not Franklin, not Geronimo, your true name?" He considered this. "My mother named me for the morning star. In your language, it doesn't translate. The whites who knew me as a child called me Thomas. Thomas Jefferson, because they thought it was funny to name Apache children after your leaders." "Thomas," she tested the name. "It suits you better than Franklin." "No name suits me now. I am between names, as I am between worlds." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm coming. You should go." "What about you?" "The desert is my home, rain or shine. It makes no difference." He paused. "But you, your paints will run." As if to emphasize his words, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Eleanor hastily packed up her supplies, acutely aware of him watching her. When she turned to say goodbye, he was already moving away. "Thomas." He stopped but didn't turn. "Will I see you again?" "That would be unwise." "That's not an answer." He looked back then, and his smile was sharp as flint. "Look for me where the town fears to go. Paint the truth, and perhaps you'll find more than you seek." The rain came harder, and Eleanor had no choice but to flee for town. By the time she reached the boarding house, she was soaked through, her careful painting reduced to running colors. But she found herself smiling as she dripped on Mrs. Henderson's clean floors, ignoring the woman's scolding. She had a name now, Thomas, and a challenge: paint the truth, and find more than she sought. Outside, the rain turned the dust to mud, washing the desert clean for tomorrow's truths. And somewhere in that vast expanse, a lone Apache warrior made his way through the storm, carrying the image of a stubborn woman with paint-stained fingers and eyes that saw too much. Both of them, in their separate solitudes, thought of possibilities they dared not name and futures they could not permit. But the desert had its own plans, patient and inexorable as the rain that carved new channels in ancient stone. The weeks following the rainstorm brought an unusual coolness to the desert, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Eleanor found herself developing a routine that would have scandalized her Boston acquaintances. She rose before dawn, took her breakfast in the kitchen with Mrs. Henderson's hired girl, and was out on the trail as the first light touched the mesas. She told herself she was documenting the frontier, building a portfolio of work that would establish her as a serious artist. She didn't acknowledge that her roots always skirted the edges of Apache territory, or that her eyes searched every shadow for a familiar silhouette. The town, meanwhile, had begun to accept her as one of its peculiar fixtures. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Carnegie, who claimed distant relation to the steel magnate, would save back the latest newspapers from Tucson. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named John Henry, had taken to checking her horse's shoes without being asked. Even the saloon girls, who conducted their business in the rooms above the Copper Palace, would nod to her on the street with something approaching respect. It was at the general store, sorting through a shipment of art supplies she'd ordered from San Francisco, that Eleanor first encountered resistance to her wandering. "Miss Roosevelt, a word if I may." The voice belonged to Samuel Morse, no relation to the inventor, as he was quick to clarify, though he possessed a similar aptitude for mechanical things. He served as the town's unofficial mayor, banker, and moral compass, a combination that made him both indispensable and insufferable. Eleanor straightened from examining a new set of sable brushes. "Mr. Morse, I hear you've been riding out alone, regularly." His thin face was creased with disapproval. "That's not wise, Miss Roosevelt. Not wise at all. I appreciate your concern, but I assure you, there've been incidents." He lowered his voice, glancing around the store as if Apache warriors might be hiding behind the pickle barrels. "The Jackson Ranch lost cattle last week, stolen in the night." Cattle theft is hardly unusual in frontier territories, Eleanor said, "and it's more often the work of white rustlers than Apache raiders." Morse's face darkened. "You seem remarkably well informed about Apache habits for someone so newly arrived." Before Eleanor could respond, another voice cut in. "Leave the lady be, Samuel." Eleanor turned to see a woman she'd noticed, but never spoken to Calamity Jane, though surely that wasn't her real name. She dressed like a man, in worn leather and denim, with a gun belt slung low on her hips. The townspeople gave her a wide berth, torn between disapproval and the practical knowledge that she was the best scout in the territory. "This doesn't concern you," Morse said stiffly. "Anything involving folks minding their own business concerns me." Jane's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Besides, I like a woman with sand. Not many would ride out alone in this country." "That's precisely the problem," Morse insisted. "It's not proper, it's not safe, and it reflects poorly on our community." "Since when do we care about proper?" Jane laughed. "Hell, Samuel, half this town is running from something back east. Let the lady paint her pictures." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward this unexpected ally. "Thank you, Miss—" "Jane's fine. Calamity Jane when I'm drinking, which is most times." She winked. "You ever want company on those rides? You let me know. I know trails that make your artist heart sing." After Morse huffed off and Jane wandered out, Eleanor paid for her supplies with hands that trembled slightly. The confrontation had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Not because of Morse's disapproval she'd faced worse in Boston, but because it forced her to examine her own motivations. Why was she taking such risks? What was she really looking for out there in the wild spaces? The answer came 3 days later, in a place she'd been half seeking, half avoiding. She'd ridden farther than usual, following a dry riverbed that wound between towering red rocks. The landscape here was different, more intimate, with hidden groves of cottonwoods and pools of water that reflected the sky like mirrors. She was setting up her easel beside one such pool when she heard the splash. Thomas stood waist-deep in the water, his dark hair loose and dripping. For a moment, Eleanor forgot to breathe. Water ran down his bronze skin, and she could see the scars that marked his chest and arms, evidence of a life lived in constant physical danger. He was beautiful and dangerous, and utterly unself-conscious as he regarded her with those fathomless eyes. "You're far from safety," he said, as casually as if they were meeting in a parlor rather than a hidden oasis. Eleanor found her voice with effort. "So are you." "This is my place, sacred to my people." He moved through the water toward the bank, and Eleanor turned away, heat flooding her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'll leave." "No." The words stopped her. "You're here now. The spirits will decide if you belong." She heard him emerge from the water, the soft sounds of dressing. When he spoke again, he was closer. "Why do you keep seeking the edges?" Eleanor Roosevelt. She turned to find him clothed, though his hair still dripped. "I could ask you the same question. I told you, I am between worlds, and I'm trying to find mine." The admission surprised her with its honesty. "In Boston, I was suffocating. Every day planned, every word scripted, every choice made for me. Here," she gestured to the wild beauty around them. "Here I can breathe." "Breathing is not the same as living." "Then teach me the difference." The words hung between them, charged with meanings neither dared acknowledge. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the war in his eyes, desire battling against determination, hope against experience. Finally, he moved to where she'd set up her easel. "You want to paint this place?" "Yes." "Then paint it true. This pool," he knelt beside it, "is where my people come for visions. Young men fast and wait for the spirits to speak. Women come here for naming ceremonies." His voice carried the weight of memory. "My sister was named here." Bright water, for the way the sun danced on the surface the day she was born. "Where is she now?" "Dead. Soldiers came to our winter camp 5 years ago. Mistake, they said later. Wrong band of Apache. Sorry for the inconvenience." The bitterness in his voice could have etched stone. Eleanor's hand moved without conscious thought, coming to rest on his shoulder. He tensed but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry." "Your sorrow changes nothing." "No, but it's all I have to offer." He looked up at her then, and something shifted in his expression. "Paint," he said roughly. "I'll watch." For the next hour, Eleanor worked in silence while Thomas sat nearby, his presence both distraction and inspiration. She found herself painting not just the physical beauty of the place, but trying to capture its spiritual significance, the quality of light that made the ordinary sacred, the sense of timelessness that hung in the air like incense. "You see it," Thomas said suddenly. "Not many whites can see the spirit of a place." "My grandmother was Irish. She said we had the sight in our blood, the ability to see beyond the veil." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "My father thought it was superstitious nonsense." "Your father is a fool." Eleanor laughed, surprising them both. "Yes, but a wealthy, powerful fool, which counts for everything in Boston. And here, he's just a man who's never seen a sunset paint the rocks like blood and fire, never heard coyotes sing the moon to sleep." She set down her brush. "Here, I think perhaps I'm wealthier than he'll ever be." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a story my grandmother told, about a woman who fell in love with a star. Every night she would climb the highest mesa to be closer to him, and every night he would shine brighter just for her. But stars and humans cannot touch. The space between them is too vast. How does the story end? She jumped, trying to reach him. The star caught her spirit and made her into a star as well. Now they shine together, but they can never return to Earth. Eleanor felt the weight of the parable. That's a sad story. Truth often is. He stood abruptly. You should go. Storm coming. Eleanor looked at the cloudless sky. I don't see... Different kind of storm. His jaw was tight. There are men in town asking questions. White men who don't like Apache who speak English, who move too freely. They're stirring up fear. What kind of men? The kind who profit from fear, who need an enemy to justify their presence. He moved closer, and Eleanor could see the urgency in his eyes. Stay away from the edges for a while. Stay where it's safe. Safe is just another word for cage. Cages keep things out as well as in... His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell. I won't have your blood on my conscience. My blood is my own to risk. Spoken like someone who's never seen it spilled. The harshness was back in his voice. Go home, Eleanor. Paint your pictures in town. Forget you found this place. Forget you mean... He didn't deny it. Yes. I can't. The admission cost her. But it was true. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But you're there in every sunset, every shadow. I hear your voice in the wind. I'm haunted by a ghost who won't stay properly dead. I'm no ghost. He moved closer still, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Ghosts don't burn like this. Ghosts don't lie awake, wondering if a stubborn white woman made it home safe. Ghosts don't. He cut himself off, stepping back as if she'd scalded him. This is why I can't love you, because I already begin to. Eleanor's heart was thunder in her chest. Thomas. Go! The word was raw. Now, before I do something that destroys us both. This time, Eleanor obeyed. She packed with shaking hands, mounted her horse with the legs that felt like water. As she rode away, she looked back once to see him standing by the sacred pool, a figure carved from loneliness and longing. Back in town, she found the atmosphere changed. Groups of men clustered on corners, voices low and urgent. Mrs. Henderson met her at the door, face creased with worry. Thank the Lord. I was about to send John Henry looking for you. She ushered Eleanor inside. There's been trouble. A prospector found dead out by Skeleton Canyon. Apaches, they're saying, though nobody's proved anything. Eleanor's blood chilled. When? This morning, and there's worse. Some men rode in from Tucson. Indian hunters, they call themselves, offering bounties for Apache scalps. The older woman's voice was disgusted. As if we need that kind of help. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the sounds of the town louder than usual, charged with tension. She thought of Thomas's warning, of the storm he'd seen coming. Not a storm of wind and rain, but of hate and fear and greed. She thought, too, of his admission. Because I already begin to love her. He'd meant the words should have thrilled her. Instead, they terrified her, because she was beginning to understand what he already knew, that love between them wasn't just forbidden. It was impossible. The space between their worlds was as vast as the space between Earth and stars. But understanding and accepting were two different things. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who had defied her father and society to come west, who painted truth in a land of comfortable lies, was not ready to accept defeat. Not yet. In the darkness, she made a decision. If storms were coming, if their time was limited, then she would make the most of what they had. She would continue to ride out, continue to paint, continue to meet him in the sacred spaces where their worlds briefly touched. She would store up memories against the lean times ahead, when duty and prejudice and the weight of other people's hate would drive them apart. She would love him, If only in silence. If only in stolen moments. If only in the space between one heartbeat and the next. It would have to be enough. Outside, a coyote howled, and the sound was like grief given voice. Eleanor pressed her face into her pillow and did not cry. Cowboys didn't cry. Calamity Jane had told her that afternoon. And neither did women who chose to love Apache warriors in a world that would see them both destroyed for it. The desert waited, patient and eternal, keeping its secrets. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Thomas stood guard, watching the town lights flicker like fallen stars, fighting a battle that had already been lost the moment a stubborn woman with paint-stained fingers had looked at him and seen not an enemy, but a man. The Indian hunters had made camp at the edge of town, their presence like a dark stain spreading across the desert. Eleanor watched them from her window as they cleaned their rifles and counted their ammunition. Their leader, a man who called himself Andrew Jackson, though he bore no resemblance to the late president holding court in the Copper Palace saloon. His voice carried on the night air, full of poison and promise. $5 for every Apache scalp, he was saying. Man, woman, or child, the government may have gone soft, but there are those who remember what needs doing. Eleanor's stomach turned. She'd heard of such men, bounty hunters who couldn't distinguish between hostile and peaceful Indians, who didn't care to try. The town's reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the protection. Others worried about stirring up trouble where none existed. It had been a week since her last encounter with Thomas at the sacred pool. A week of painting safe subjects near town, of pretending contentment while her heart pulled her toward the wild places. But his warning echoed in her mind, and the presence of the hunters made the danger real in a way it hadn't been before. She was mixing paints in the boarding house parlor when Calamity Jane burst through the door, her usual swagger replaced by urgency. "Miss Roosevelt, you need to hear this." Jane glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I was scouting up near Devil's Canyon, saw Apache sign a whole band moving south, away from their usual territory." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Thomas's people?" Jane's eyes sharpened. "Thomas, is it you know more than you've been letting on?" We've encountered each other while I was painting." "Encountered?" Jane's laugh was humorless. "That's one way to put it. Listen, girl, I don't judge. Lord knows I've made my own unconventional choices. But this is different. Those hunters aren't going to care if your Thomas is peaceful. They see Apache. They shoot." "He's not my Thomas," Eleanor said automatically. "No, then why do you look like someone just put a knife in your gut?" Eleanor had no answer for that. Jane studied her for a moment, then sighed. "There's more. The band that's moving, they're heading for Mexico. Smart move with hunters in the territory, but there's been shooting up near the border. Army patrols, Mexican federales. It's a death trap. I have to warn him." "Like hell you do." Jane grabbed Eleanor's arm as she rose. "You ride out there now. You'll lead those hunters straight to him. They're watching you. Girl, Jackson's got it in his head that you're an Indian lover." The slur hit Eleanor like a slap. "How dare he?" "He dares because he can. Because fear makes good money, and dead Indians can't dispute whose scalp is whose." Jane's weathered face was grim. "You want to help your Thomas stay put? Let them think you've lost interest." It was sound advice, logical advice. Eleanor ignored it completely. That night, she waited until the boarding house was silent, then slipped out through the kitchen. She'd left her horse saddled in the lean-to behind the hen house. Supplies already packed. The moon was new, leaving only starlight to guide her. But she knew the way by now. Her body remembered the rhythm of the trail, the landmarks that looked different in darkness but still whispered their names. She was halfway to the sacred pool when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Her heart seized. She urged her mare faster, but the pursuit matched her pace. There was nowhere to hide on the open trail, nowhere to run that wouldn't lead them straight to. "Eleanor." She recognized the voice and reined in so sharply her horse reared. "Ulysses Grant, the town's doctor. Not the general rode up beside her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "Dr. Grant, what are you?" "Jane sent me. Said you'd do something foolish and need someone with medical supplies." He patted his saddlebags. "Also said to tell you she's laying a false trail north, leading Jackson's men on a merry chase. We have maybe 3 hours before they realize they've been tricked." Eleanor could have kissed the man. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm only here because I took an oath to do no harm, and letting you ride into danger alone seemed like harm by omission." He studied her in the darkness. "This Apache you're risking everything for, he's worth it." "Yes." "Then we'd best hurry." They rode hard, pushing their horses as much as they dared. The sacred pool was empty, but Eleanor hadn't expected to find him there. Instead, she led Dr. Grant higher into the canyons, following paths Thomas had shown her, reading signs he'd taught her to recognize. They found the band just before dawn, hidden in a box canyon with only one entrance. Eleanor's appearance caused a stir. Women reached for children, men for weapons. But then Thomas emerged from the shadows, and the sight of him, alive, whole, here made her knees weak with relief. "What are you doing?" His voice was controlled fury. "I told you to stay away." "There are hunters in town, scalp hunters. Your people need to know." "We know." He cut her off. "Why do you think we're moving?" His eyes flicked to Dr. Grant. "And you brought a white man to our camp." "A doctor." Eleanor said, "In case." Jane said there's been shooting at the border. Something in Thomas's expression shifted. He spoke rapidly in Apache to a woman nearby, who nodded and beckoned to Dr. Grant. "We have wounded," Thomas admitted. "2 men caught in crossfire between army patrols." He looked at the doctor. "Will you help?" "Of course." Dr. Grant dismounted, following the woman without hesitation. Left alone with Thomas, Eleanor felt the weight of all the words they couldn't say. Around them, the camp was stirring, men checking weapons, women packing what little they carried, children rubbing sleep from their eyes. It was a scene of quiet desperation, people preparing to run because standing still meant death. "You shouldn't have come," Thomas said finally. "You're right. I'm probably being watched. I've probably put you all in more danger." Eleanor met his eyes. "I don't care. I couldn't let you leave without—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Without what?" His voice was rough. "A goodbye." "There are no goodbyes between us, Eleanor. Only a series of moments that should never have been." "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't diminish what we have just because it's difficult." "Difficult?" He laughed bitterly. "Your people want to kill mine for money. My people see you as the enemy. We have no common language, no shared future, no—" Eleanor kissed him. It was graceless, desperate, tasting of dust and desperation. For a moment, he stood frozen. Then his arms came around her, crushing her against him as if he could merge their bodies into something that belonged to both worlds and neither. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "You make me weak," he whispered. "You make me strong," she replied. A shout from the camp shattered the moment. One of the scouts was signaling riders approaching, many riders. "The hunters," Eleanor breathed. Thomas was already moving, calling orders in Apache. The camp exploded into motion, weapons grabbed, horses saddled, children lifted onto their mothers' backs. But Eleanor could see the truth in their faces. They were exhausted, some wounded. They couldn't outrun fresh horses and men eager for blood money. "Take the women and children through the back trail." Thomas told the woman who'd led Dr. Grant away. "Fighting men stay here. We'll buy you time." "That's suicide." Eleanor said, "There has to be another way." "There is—" Calamity Jane's voice rang out from the canyon entrance. She rode in bold as brass. Leading a group of men Eleanor recognized John Henry the blacksmith. Marcus Twain, the storyteller. Even Samuel Morse looking uncomfortable on his banker's horse. Brought some friends who think scalp hunting is bad for business. Andrew Jackson and his hunters appeared moments later, pulling up short when they saw the townspeople arrayed between them and the Apache camp. "Stand aside," Jackson growled. "This ain't your concern." "See, that's where you're wrong," Jane said conversationally. "These Apache are peaceful. They trade with us. Their absence would be bad for the local economy." "Economy," Jackson spat. "They're savages." "Savages who pay good money for supplies," Samuel Morse said, surprising everyone. "And who keep the actual hostiles from raiding our town. Balance, Mr. Jackson. It's all about balance." The tension stretched taut. Eleanor counted weapons. The hunters had more guns, but the townspeople had position and determination. And the Apache, despite Thomas's orders, hadn't fled. They stood ready, dignified in their defiance. It was Dr. Grant who broke the standoff. He emerged from treating the wounded, his clothes blood-stained, his face haggard. "Mr. Jackson, as a medical man, I feel obligated to inform you that there's sickness in this camp. Fever. Could be contagious." He coughed dramatically. "I'm feeling a bit poorly myself." The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Disease was the one enemy they couldn't shoot. Jackson's face twisted with frustrated rage. "This ain't over. The territory's changing. Soon there won't be room for Apache lovers and their pet Indians." He wheeled his horse around. "Mount up, boys. We'll find better hunting elsewhere." They left, but everyone knew it was a temporary reprieve. The townspeople lingered awkwardly, unsure how to bridge the gap between worlds they'd just defended. It was Marcus Twain who found the words. "Well, that's a story worth telling. The day Copper Creek stood for something besides copper." He tipped his hat to Thomas. "Safe travels, friend." One by one, they left, until only Eleanor, Dr. Grant, and Jane remained. The doctor was packing his medical supplies, promising to return if needed. Jane pulled Eleanor aside. "This can't last, you know that." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "I know." "But you're going to ride this trail anyway, wherever it leads." "Yes." Jane smiled sadly. "Then you're braver or more foolish than I thought. Maybe both." She mounted her horse. "I'll keep Jackson distracted as long as I can, but eventually—" She didn't need to finish. Eventually, the world would intrude. Eventually, choices would have to be made. When they were gone. Eleanor found Thomas standing at the canyon's edge, watching the sunrise paint the rocks in shades of blood and gold. "Your people surprised me," he said without turning. "People can surprise themselves sometimes." She moved to stand beside him. "Will you still go to Mexico?" "We have to. This territory is poisoned now. The hunters will return. With more men, more guns." He was silent for a moment. "You could come with us." Eleanor's heart leapt, then fell. "We both know I can't. I'd be a burden, a danger. My presence would mark your people as surely as war paint." "Yes." The word was soft, accepting. "And I can't stay. My duty is to my people, to see them safe." "I know." They stood together watching the light change, each memorizing the other's presence. Finally, Thomas turned to her. "You asked once about Apache courtship, how a man shows interest in a woman." He pulled something from his pouch, a small leather bag decorated with beadwork. "He gives her something made by his hands, something that carries his spirit." Eleanor took the bag with trembling fingers. Inside was a carved stone, smooth and warm, shaped like a star. "The morning star," she whispered. "So you'll remember. When you look at the dawn, remember there was an Apache who loved you enough to let you go." "Thomas," her voice broke. He kissed her then, soft and fierce and final. "Paint the truth. Eleanor Roosevelt. Paint it so others might see and know that somewhere, in whatever dawn finds me, I'll be watching the same star. The camp was ready to move. Thomas walked away without looking back, mounting his horse and leading his people out through hidden trails toward an uncertain future. Eleanor stood alone in the canyon, clutching the starstone, until the last echo of hoofbeats faded. Then she mounted her own horse and rode back toward town, toward a life that would never quite fit again. But she would paint, she would remember, and she would watch the morning star rise, knowing that somewhere, across whatever distance lay between them. Thomas watched it too. The sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who had come west to find herself, discovered that sometimes you found yourself only to lose your heart. It was a trade she hadn't expected to make. But as she rode through the awakening desert, the starstone warm against her chest, she couldn't regret it. Some things were worth the price you paid for them. Some loves were worth the losing. Behind her, the sacred lands stood empty, keeping their secrets. Ahead, the town waited, full of questions she wouldn't answer. And above, the morning star faded into day, invisible but constant, a promise that some things endured even when you couldn't see them anymore. The days following Thomas's departure blended into one another like watercolors in the rain. Eleanor moved through them mechanically rising, eating, painting, sleeping, but her heart wasn't in any of it. Mrs. Henderson noticed, of course, clucking over her like a worried hen, pressing extra helpings of food she couldn't taste. The town noticed too, though most attributed her melancholy to the shock of the confrontation with the scalp hunters. Only Calamity Jane knew the truth, and she kept her own counsel, occasionally leaving small gifts on Eleanor's windowsill, a hawk feather, a piece of turquoise, things that spoke of the wild places without words. It was on such a gray morning, 3 weeks after the Apache band had vanished into the southern wastes, that Eleanor made her decision. She was staring at a half-finished painting of the sacred pool, unable to capture the light that had made it holy, when the futility of her situation crashed over her like a flash flood. She was living a half-life, neither fully in the world she'd left behind nor the one she'd glimpsed with Thomas. The starstone hung around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, a constant reminder of what she'd lost, or rather, what she'd never truly had. The weight of it was drowning her. "I can't do this anymore," she said aloud to the empty room. Within an hour, she was packing. Not everything she left: the canvases that didn't matter, the dresses she'd never worn, the pretenses she'd carried from Boston. She kept only the essentials: her painting supplies, her riding clothes, the Colt revolver, and the memories she couldn't leave behind if she tried. Mrs. Henderson found her loading her saddlebags. "So, you're leaving?" It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "Running towards something or away from it?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Maybe both. Maybe neither. I just know I can't stay here, painting shadows of a life I'm not living." The older woman studied her with eyes that had seen too many frontier stories, and badly. "You're not the first woman to lose her heart to this land. Won't be the last. The desert takes as much as it gives." "It's already taken everything," Eleanor said softly. "No, child. If it had taken everything, you'd stay. Let yourself fade into the dust like a ghost. The fact that you're leaving means there's still something in you fighting to live." Mrs. Henderson pulled her into an unexpected embrace. "You go on, then. Find whatever it is you're looking for. Just remember, this place will be here if you need it." Eleanor left at noon, when the sun was high and harsh, burning away sentimentality. She didn't take the southern trail. That way lay only pain and impossibility. Instead, she turned east, toward the railroad towns, and eventually back to the world she'd fled. Not to Boston. She could never go back to that gilded cage, but somewhere new, somewhere she could paint and breathe and maybe, eventually, forget. She made it 20 miles before admitting she was being followed. The rider kept pace, neither closing the distance nor falling back. Eleanor's hand drifted to her revolver, but something made her hesitate. Bandits didn't announce themselves so obviously. She reined in her mare at a cluster of rocks that offered cover and waited. The figure that appeared wasn't what she expected. A young Apache man, perhaps 20, wearing a mix of traditional and Mexican clothing. He approached with his hands visible and empty. "You are the woman who paints," he said in careful English. Eleanor kept her hand near her weapon. "Who's asking?" "I am called Benjamin Franklin." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "My sister gave me that name. She said if Apaches must have white names, they should be important ones." Something in his voice made Eleanor's breath catch. "Your sister, Brightwater, she who was killed 5 winters ago." He studied her with eyes that were familiar in their intensity. "My brother sent me." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "Thomas?" Benjamin nodded. "He says you are leaving. He says this is good. He says—" The young man paused, clearly uncomfortable with his role as messenger. "He says to tell you he was wrong." "About what?" "He said you would understand." Eleanor closed her eyes. Seeing Thomas's face that last morning, hearing his words, "I can't love you." He'd been wrong about that. He could love her. He did love her. He just couldn't keep her. "Where is he?" she asked, though she knew Benjamin wouldn't tell her. "South, fighting. Always fighting." The young man's voice held a mixture of pride and weariness. "The Mexican soldiers harass our camps. The American army pushes from the north. We are pressed between 2 stones." "Why did he send you really—" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pouch and withdrew something wrapped in deerskin. "He said if you were truly leaving, to give you this, if you were staying, to take it back." Eleanor unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph, one she recognized with a shock. It was the portrait she'd had taken in Tucson weeks ago, on a whim, thinking to send it to her sister. She'd been wearing her riding clothes, her hair loose, smiling at something the photographer had said. She looked free, happy. But how had Thomas gotten it? "He went to the white man's town," Benjamin said, reading her expression. "Alone, at night, paid the photograph man gold to make a copy." His voice held wonder and disapproval in equal measure. "He risked everything for a picture." Eleanor clutched the photograph, understanding flooding through her. He'd wanted something of her to keep, just as she had the Starstone, a piece of her to carry into whatever future awaited him. "I have something for him too," she said suddenly. She pulled out her sketchbook, finding the portrait she'd drawn from memory Thomas by firelight, the one image she'd managed to capture true. She tore it out carefully and handed it to Benjamin. Tell him the morning star shines everywhere, even when we can't see it." Benjamin took the drawing with the same care he'd shown the photograph. "I will tell him." He turned to go, then paused. "He also said if you change your mind, if you choose to stay, the sacred pool will remember you." Then he was gone, melting back into the landscape like smoke. Eleanor sat for a long time, holding the photograph, weighing choices that all led to heartbreak. East meant safety, society, a life half lived. West meant danger, isolation, and the constant ache of proximity to what she couldn't have. In the end, it was the photograph that decided her. Thomas had risked his life for it, entering a white town where any trigger-happy citizen might have shot him for sport. He'd done it because he needed something tangible to hold on to. And if he needed that, if the great Apache warrior who spoke of acceptance and letting go needed a piece of her to keep, then maybe she'd needed to stay close enough to matter. Not in his life, that path was closed, but in the same sky, under the same stars, painting the same truths. She turned her horse north, toward the mining camps and frontier settlements where a woman with a quick brush and a steady eye could make a living. Not Copper Creek, that chapter was closed, but there were other towns, other territories, other canvases waiting to be filled. The decision, once made, lifted the weight from her chest. She wasn't choosing happiness that was beyond her reach, but she was choosing life over mere existence, choosing to stay in the land that had claimed her heart even as it broke it. She made camp that night by a small spring, building her fire carefully, the way Thomas had taught her. As darkness fell, she pulled out her paints and began to work by firelight, painting from memory his hands as they'd shaped the fire, the line of his profile against the stars, the way he'd looked at her that last morning, love and renunciation written in every line of his face. She painted through the night, filling page after page with truth and loss and terrible beauty. When dawn came, she had a dozen small paintings spread around her like offerings, each one a piece of the story she couldn't tell any other way. A sound made her look up, a rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought, but no, this rider was smaller, moving differently. As the figure descended, Eleanor recognized another Apache scout, this one bearing military insignia. "Miss Roosevelt." The voice was professionally neutral. "I'm William Sherman's scout for Fort Buchanan, not the general." Another name borrowed from fame. "I have a message from Colonel Grant, the real one, not our doctor." Eleanor's wariness sharpened. "What does the Army want with me?" "There's to be a peace conference, 3 weeks hence, at Fort Buchanan. Apache leaders and government representatives." William Sherman's face revealed nothing. "The Colonel has heard of your artwork, your portraits of Apache life. He believes they might help the Eastern politicians understand the human cost of their policies. And if I refuse, then you refuse." He shrugged. "But the Colonel wanted me to tell you that a certain Apache war chief will be there, one who speaks English, one who might benefit from having someone present who sees his people as more than savages." Eleanor's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Thomas will be there. I've said what I was told to say." William Sherman turned his horse. "The fort is 3 days' ride northwest. The conference begins on the new moon. Do with that information what you will." He rode away, leaving Eleanor with a choice that was no choice at all. Of course she would go. How could she not? Even knowing it would tear fresh wounds in her barely healed heart. Even knowing that seeing him in an official capacity would underscore every reason they could never be together. She packed up her paintings, doused her fire, and set out for Fort Buchanan. The journey took her through varied terrain, desert giving way to grassland to pine-covered mountains. She stopped in small settlements along the way, trading sketches for supplies, listening to the talk of the coming conference. Opinions were mixed. Some saw it as a chance for real peace, others as a trap for the Apache leaders. Everyone agreed it was unprecedented. Never before had the government invited Apache chiefs to speak as equals, to have their words recorded and sent to Washington. Eleanor arrived at Fort Buchanan the day before the conference. The fort was a hive of activity, soldiers drilling, supply wagons arriving, interpreters practicing their vocabulary. She was directed to Colonel Ulysses Grant, the real one, who'd been posted to this forgotten corner of the territory as either punishment or test, depending on who you asked. Grant was younger than she'd expected, with tired eyes and steady hands. "Miss Roosevelt, I've seen your work. Sergeant Major Hancock showed me the sketches you did of his men. You have a gift for capturing truth." "Truth is all I know how to paint anymore. Colonel." "Good, because truth is what we need here." He gestured to a table covered with maps and documents. "The Apache are being pressed from all sides. Mexico wants them dead. The territory wants them gone. Washington wants them controlled. And they just want to survive." "Why do you care?" Eleanor asked bluntly. "Most military men see them as obstacles to be removed." Grant's smile was rueful. Because I've been a soldier long enough to know that today's enemy is tomorrow's ally. And because I've seen what happens when we let fear and greed dictate policy. It's always the innocents who pay. He assigned her quarters a small adobe building that served as guest housing. From her window, she could see the parade ground where the conference would be held. Already, Apache camps were visible in the distance, the different bands keeping careful space between them. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, searching the camps for familiar signs, wondering if Thomas was out there, if he was thinking of her, if he regretted sending her his message through Benjamin. The starstone was warm against her skin, and she clutched it like a talisman. Dawn brought the first delegations, Apache leaders in their finest regalia, faces painted for ceremony, dignity radiating from every line, army officials in dress uniforms, sweating in the desert heat, interpreters moving between groups, trying to bridge languages that had no common words for the concepts being discussed. Eleanor set up her easel at the edge of the gathering, close enough to see and hear, but not so close as to intrude. She began sketching immediately the contrast between the two groups, the tension in the air, the way hope and suspicion warred in every face. And then she saw him. Thomas entered with a small group of warriors, and even among such company, he stood out. He wore traditional Apache dress, but carried himself with an authority that transcended culture. His face was painted with symbols she didn't recognize, his hair bound with eagle feathers. He looked magnificent and distant, every inch the war chief. Their eyes met across the crowd. For one endless moment, the world stopped. Then Thomas looked away, his expression giving nothing to the watching crowd. But Eleanor had seen the flash of recognition, the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand had moved unconsciously toward his chest, where perhaps he carried a folded drawing. The conference began with speeches long, formal declarations from both sides. The Apache spoke of broken treaties, of land stolen and promises betrayed. The government officials spoke of progress and civilization, of the inevitable march of history. Eleanor painted it all, her brush moving with desperate energy, trying to capture not just faces but the weight of history in the making. It was late afternoon when Thomas rose to speak. Unlike many of the others, he spoke in English, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. "You ask us to accept reservation life," he said, "to farm land that has never known the plow, to live in square houses when we are people of the circle. You ask us to stop being Apache and become tame Indians, shadows of ourselves." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd, lingering for just a moment on Eleanor. "But I ask you, what is the price of your civilization? How many must die for your progress? How many children must forget their grandfather's songs so that your trains can run on time?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the army officials shifted uncomfortably. "We do not hate the white man," Thomas continued. "We hate what the white man's greed does to the land, to the water, to the sacred places. We hate the lies that come wrapped in treaty paper. We hate watching our children starve while men get rich selling bullets meant for our hearts. And yet," his voice softened, "we know that the old ways are ending. We are not fools. We see the numbers against us, the armies that grow larger each season. So we come here, to this place, to ask not for the impossible, not for the return of what is lost, but for the possible, for land that is truly ours, not subject to the whims of distant politicians, for the right to raise our children as Apache, not as failed white men, for peace with honor, not surrender with shame." He sat down to complete silence. Then, slowly, one of the territorial officials began to clap. Others joined, and soon the parade ground echoed with unexpected applause. Even some of the soldiers, who'd fought these men, who'd lost friends to Apache raids, were nodding with respect. Eleanor realized she was crying. She'd captured his speech in quick sketches, his proud stance, his gestures. The faces of those listening, but no painting could capture the courage it took to stand before your conquerors and demand humanity. The conference continued for 2 more days. There were arguments, accusations, moments when it seemed violence might erupt. But there were also unexpected connections, a soldier and a warrior discovering they'd fought in the same battle on opposite sides, now sharing water and comparing scars. Children from both communities playing together despite their parents' watchful eyes. Eleanor painted it all, building a visual record that she knew would outlast whatever agreements were made. On the last night, there was a feast, an awkward affair with Apache fry bread and army beef. Traditional drums competing with a military band. She was cleaning her brushes when a shadow fell across her work. "You came," Thomas said quietly. Eleanor didn't turn, didn't trust herself to maintain composure if she saw his face. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you had found wisdom. Wisdom and I have never been well acquainted." She set down her brushes, finally meeting his eyes. "Your speech was beautiful. Words change nothing." "You're wrong. Words change everything. They're all we have to bridge the space between worlds." She gestured to her paintings spread out to dry. "These images, your words, they matter. They'll be seen in Washington, in places where Apache are only known as numbers in casualty reports." "And you think this will save us?" "No." Eleanor's voice was steady. "But it might save your children. It might buy time for adaptation instead of annihilation. It might mean the difference between death and transformation." Thomas was quiet, studying her paintings. His face was unreadable. The war chief mask firmly in place, but his hand, hanging at his side, trembled slightly. "I should not have sent Benjamin, should not have kept your image, should not have—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "You make me weak, Eleanor Roosevelt. You make me hope for things that cannot be." "Then we're even, because you make me strong enough to bear the impossible." They stood there, separated by mere inches and infinite miles, surrounded by the sleeping fort and all it represented. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "The conference ends tomorrow. We go back to our territories. Wait to see if the white chiefs in Washington honor these words." He paused. "I will not see you again." Eleanor's throat closed. She managed a single word, "No." "But know this." He reached out, his fingers barely brushing her hand where it rested on the table. "In every sunrise, I see your face. In every star, I hear your voice. You are carved into my spirit like the ancient symbols in stone. This will not change, no matter how many miles or years lie between us." Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, walking back to the Apache camps without looking back. She stood frozen, her hand burning where he'd touched it, watching his figure disappear into darkness. The next morning, the Apache delegations left at dawn. Eleanor watched from her window as they rode out. Thomas at the head of his band, back straight and eyes forward. She pressed her hand against the glass, a futile gesture of farewell. But just before he passed out of sight, Thomas turned in his saddle. Across the distance, their eyes met one last time. He raised his hand to his chest, over his heart, then touched it to his lips, a gesture so quick anyone watching might have missed it. Eleanor mirrored the gesture, the starstone warm between her fingers. Then he was gone, swallowed by the desert that had brought them together and now held them apart. Colonel Grant found her there an hour later, still at the window. "Your paintings have caused quite a stir, Miss Roosevelt. I've had 3 telegrams already from Washington, asking for copies." "I'll make them," Eleanor said dully. "What will you do now? You've captured something important here. There will be more conferences, more opportunities to document." "No." Eleanor turned from the window. "I've painted enough truth for now. I think I need to paint beauty for a while. Just beauty, without the weight of history." Grant studied her with eyes that had seen too much. "I understand. If you ever change your mind, the Army could use someone with your skills, someone who sees clearly." Eleanor gathered her paintings, her supplies, her memories. She left Fort Buchanan that afternoon, riding north toward Colorado Territory, where the mountains touched the sky, and no one would ask why she sometimes stopped to watch the sunrise with tears on her face. Behind her, the fort returned to routine. The Apache went back to their shrinking territories. The politicians in Washington filed the conference reports and moved on to other concerns. History rolled forward, indifferent to individual hearts. But in Eleanor's saddlebags, wrapped carefully against the dust, were dozens of paintings that captured a moment when two worlds met and tried to speak truth. And around her neck, hidden but ever present, hung a star-shaped stone that promised some things endured even when everything else was lost. She rode on, into a future she couldn't see, carrying the past she couldn't forget. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, Thomas did the same, two souls moving in parallel lines that would never again intersect, held apart by history but connected by a love that asked for nothing except to exist, secret and sacred as the morning star. The Colorado mountains rose around Eleanor like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with September snow. She had been painting in the mining town of Silver Ridge for 3 months now, creating portraits of miners and their families, capturing the raw beauty of the Rockies, losing herself in work that demanded nothing of her heart. The starstone remained hidden beneath her collar, a constant weight she'd grown accustomed to, like grief itself. She'd taken a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where she could see the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Every morning, she stood at her window with her coffee, watching that transformation, and every morning she whispered words in a language she didn't speak, taught to her by a man she was trying to forget. Dawn brings new light to old sorrows. It was on such a morning, the coffee still steaming in her hands, that she saw him. Not Thomas, she knew, even from a distance it wasn't him. But the rider moved with the same fluid grace, sat his horse with the same natural ease. As he drew closer, Eleanor recognized Benjamin Franklin, Thomas's young brother-in-law, though something in his bearing had changed. Gone was the uncertain boy who delivered messages. This was a man who'd seen too much too quickly. Eleanor met him at her door, her heart hammering questions she didn't dare ask. "Miss Roosevelt?" Benjamin's face was grave. "I bring news." "Is he—" She couldn't finish the question. "Alive? Wounded, but alive." Benjamin dismounted, his movements speaking of long, hard travel. "There was a fight, not a battle, a massacre. Soldiers attacked a peaceful camp at dawn. Women and children." He stopped, jaw working. "Thomas fought to give them time to escape. Took 3 bullets." Eleanor gripped the doorframe, the world tilting. "Where is he?" "Hidden. Those who survived are tending him." "But—" Benjamin met her eyes. "He burns with fever, speaks words that make no sense. Our medicine woman says his spirit is wandering between worlds, unable to choose." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in his fever, he calls for you, again and again. He speaks your name. The elders say a spirit anchored by love might find its way back." Benjamin's voice held no judgment, only exhaustion. "I've ridden 4 days to find you. Will you come?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Give me an hour." She packed with hands that shook medical supplies bought from the local doctor, clean bandages, her father's compass that she'd carried from Boston. The painting supplies went too, from habit more than thought. Within the hour, she was mounted and ready, leaving only a brief note for her landlord. They rode hard, stopping only when the horses demanded it. Benjamin led her through paths she wouldn't have found alone, across ridgelines and through valleys that seemed untouched by human presence. He told her more as they rode how the peace conference had meant nothing, how the promises had evaporated like morning dew, how the territorial government had decided the Apache problem needed a final solution. "They came at dawn," he said on the second night, sitting by their small fire. "Surrounded the camp. We'd done everything right, camped where they told us. Sent our young men to the agency for rations. But someone had whispered that we were hiding weapons, planning raids. His laugh was bitter. The only weapons we had were those needed for hunting. The only raid we planned was on the rabbit warren near camp. How many? Eleanor asked quietly. 43 dead, 15 wounded, 7 still missing. He poked at the fire with a stick. Thomas, he was magnificent, like the warriors of old. He held the gap while the people fled, fought with rifle and knife and finally bare hands. When he fell, the soldiers thought he was dead. By the time they realized otherwise, our warriors had carried him away. On the 3rd day, they descended into a hidden canyon that seemed to exist outside of time. Ancient cliff dwellings dotted the walls, and Eleanor could see smoke from carefully concealed fires. The survivors had taken shelter in this place of their ancestors, finding safety in stones that had sheltered their people for generations. Thomas lay in one of the cliff dwellings, accessible only by ladder. Eleanor climbed with her heart in her throat, Benjamin behind her carrying the medical supplies. The space was dim, lit only by filtered sunlight and a small fire. The air smelled of sage and fever sweat and something else, the metallic tang of blood. He lay on a bed of blankets, his chest wrapped in bandages spotted with red. His face was gray beneath the bronze, his breathing shallow and rapid. An elderly woman sat beside him, singing softly in Apache, her weathered hands cool on his burning forehead. 3 bullets, the woman said in English, not looking up. One here, she touched his shoulder, passed through clean. One here, his side, we dug out. But this one, she indicated his chest, near his heart. This one went deep, too deep for our knives, too close to his spirit center. Eleanor knelt beside him, her trained eyes assessing. The wounds were serious, but not necessarily fatal if infection could be prevented, if the fever could be broken, if his will to live could be strengthened. She opened her medical kit, pulling out the bottles of carbolic acid, the surgical instruments she'd learned to use during her time in frontier towns. I can help, she said, but I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and someone to hold him if he fights. The old woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You are the paint woman. He spoke of you before the fever took his words. She rose with dignity. I will bring what you need. Left alone with Thomas, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of pure emotion. She touched his face, feeling the dangerous heat, seeing the way pain had carved lines around his mouth. You stubborn fool, she whispered. You couldn't just ride away. Could you had to be a hero? His eyelids fluttered at her voice, but didn't open. She thought she heard her name, shaped more by breath than sound. The next hours blurred together cleaning wounds, fighting to bring down the fever, carefully extracting the bullet that had lodged against a rib. Thomas thrashed in delirium, speaking in Apache and English, and sometimes a mixture of both. Benjamin and another warrior held him when necessary, their face grim as Eleanor worked. Hold on, she whispered as she sutured the deepest wound. Hold on, Thomas, don't you dare leave me here alone. Night fell, then dawned again. Eleanor didn't leave his side, cooling his fever with wet cloths, forcing water between his lips, talking to him in a steady stream of words about the mountains, about her paintings, about anything that might anchor him to life. On the 2nd night, his fever broke. Eleanor was dozing, her hand on his chest to monitor his breathing. When she felt the change, the terrible heat receded like an outgoing tide, and his breathing deepened. She opened her eyes to find him looking at her, truly seeing her for the first time in days. Eleanor, his voice was a rasp. You're here, or am I dreaming? If you're dreaming, then so am I. She helped him drink, her hands trembling with relief. Benjamin came for me. You were calling my name. Something like embarrassment crossed his features. The fever spoke what I wouldn't. The fever spoke truth. She checked his bandages. All business now to hide her emotion. You nearly died. Thomas, another day, maybe 2. And I would have been too late. Perhaps that would have been better. The flatness in his voice alarmed her more than his wounds. Don't say that. Why not? My people are scattered, dying. The peace I argued for is a mockery. I failed them. Eleanor failed as a leader, as a protector. His eyes were bottomless with pain that had nothing to do with bullets. I should have chosen war with Geronimo. At least then we would have died as warriors, not slaughtered like sheep in a pen we built ourselves. Eleanor gripped his hand. You gave them time to escape. Benjamin told me. Most survived because of you. To live how hunted, starving, afraid. He turned his face away. I led them to trust the white man's promises. Their blood is on my hands. The old medicine woman entered then, carrying a bowl of broth. She studied Thomas with knowing eyes. His body heals, she told Eleanor, but his spirit is wounded deeper than any bullet can reach. Over the next days, Eleanor watched Thomas retreat into himself even as his body grew stronger. He submitted to her care but spoke little, staring at the canyon walls as if they held answers to questions he couldn't voice. The other Apache treated him with reverence. He was their war chief still, but Eleanor saw the weight of their expectations crushing him. It was Benjamin who finally spoke the truth everyone was avoiding. They want him to lead again, to fight, but he looks at the children and sees only future graves. Eleanor was sitting outside the dwelling, grinding herbs the medicine woman had shown her. What do you think he should do? I think the time for choices has passed. Benjamin's young face was old with wisdom. We can fight and die quickly, or surrender and die slowly. Either way, we die. He paused. Unless... There are Apache who've gone to Mexico. Some bands have found refuge in the Sierra Madre. It's not much of a life hiding, raiding for supplies, always moving. But it's life. He looked at her directly. He would go, I think, if not for honor, and you. Eleanor's hand stilled on the grinding stone. Me. He believes loving you makes him weak, clouds his judgment, that wanting a life with you betrays his duty to his people. Benjamin's smile was sad. He doesn't understand that love might be the only thing worth saving in all this darkness. That night, Eleanor made a decision. She waited until the canyon was quiet, then climbed to where Thomas lay. He was awake, as she'd known he would be, staring at the stars visible through the smoke hole. You're planning something, he said without looking at her. Yes. She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. I'm leaving tomorrow. That got his attention. He turned to her, wincing at the movement. Eleanor, listen to me. She placed her fingers over his lips. I'm going back to Silver Ridge. I'm going to paint and live my life and pretend I never met an Apache warrior who spoke of stars and spirits. I'm going to do this because staying here, watching you die by degrees, is killing me too. His hand came up to grasp hers. I never wanted... I know what you wanted. To protect me, to protect your people, to be the perfect leader who needs nothing and no one. She pulled her hand away. But you're not perfect. Thomas, you're a man who's been asked to carry the weight of the world, and it's crushing you. And I can't watch anymore. So you're abandoning me? There was heat in his voice now. The first real emotion she'd heard in days. No, I'm setting you free. She stood, looking down at him. You say loving me makes you weak, then stop. Choose your people, your honor, your noble death. I won't be the excuse you use to avoid living. She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. And if I choose differently... Eleanor paused at the entrance. Then you know where to find me. But Thomas, come as a man, not a martyr. Come because you want to live, not because you're afraid to die. She left him there and climbed down to spend her last night in the canyon. The medicine woman found her by the central fire. You are hard on him, the old woman observed. Someone needs to be. Everyone else treats him like he's already a ghost story. Eleanor stared into the flames. He has to want to live. I can't want it for him. And if he chooses death, then I'll paint his memory and mourn him and somehow go on." The words tasted like ashes. "But I won't watch him fade away. I won't be complicit in his surrender." The old woman patted her shoulder. "You are stronger than you know. Paint, woman. Perhaps strong enough for both of you." Eleanor left at dawn, Benjamin escorting her to the edge of Apache territory. Neither spoke of Thomas, though Eleanor could feel questions radiating from the young man. At their parting place, he finally asked, "What should I tell him?" "Tell him the morning star is constant, whether we watch for it or not." She touched the hidden stone at her throat. "And tell him I understand now why he said he couldn't love me. Because love demands courage, and courage is harder than sacrifice." The ride back to Silver Ridge was the longest of her life. Each mile felt like a betrayal, each hoofbeat an abandonment. But she held to her course, knowing that sometimes the only way to save someone was to stop trying to save them. Her cabin was as she'd left it, dusty and waiting. She unpacked mechanically, trying not to think of Thomas lying in that cliff dwelling, trying not to wonder if she'd just made the greatest mistake of her life. The starstone was heavy around her neck, and she almost took it off. Almost. Instead, she set up her easel and began to paint. Not the mountains or the miners or the pretty scenes that sold well. She painted Memory Thomas as he'd been in health, proud and strong and alive with purpose. She painted him not as the broken man in the canyon, but as the warrior who'd challenged governments with words, who'd risked everything for a photograph, who'd loved her despite every reason not to. Days passed, a week, 2. Eleanor painted and waited and tried not to hope. The first snows came early, blanketing the peaks in white. She learned to bank her fires against the cold, to read the weather in the way the clouds gathered. She learned to be alone without being lonely, carrying on internal conversations with a man who might already be dead. It was on such a night, the wind howling around her cabin like a live thing, that she heard the knock, soft, almost tentative. She opened the door with her heart in her throat. Thomas stood there, gaunt but upright, snow in his hair and purpose in his eyes. Behind him, she could see Benjamin with their horses. "I chose," Thomas said simply. Eleanor couldn't speak. She pulled him inside, into warmth and light, her hands checking his still healing wounds even as tears coursed down her face. He was thinner, marked by his ordeal, but his eyes were alive again. "My people are going to Mexico," he said as she helped him to a chair. "Those who want to fight. The others," he paused, struggling. "The others will go to the reservation. Try to adapt. Perhaps some will survive that way. And you." "I chose a third path." He caught her hands, stilling their nervous movement. "I chose to live, not as Apache, not as white, but as something new, something that hasn't been named yet." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "I chose you, Eleanor, if you'll have me. Not because I'm weak, but because loving you is the strongest thing I've ever done." Eleanor kissed him then, tasting snow and determination and the salt of her own tears. When they parted, she saw Benjamin had entered, setting their saddlebags by the door. "So what now?" she asked. "Now we go north," Thomas said. "Canada. Maybe somewhere we can be ourselves without the weight of other people's wars. Benjamin knows others Apache, Mexican, even some whites who've made lives in the spaces between worlds." "A life in the margins," Eleanor murmured. "A life," Thomas corrected. "That's all. That's everything." Eleanor looked around her cabin, the paintings on the walls, the life she'd built in isolation. Then she looked at Thomas, still wounded but choosing hope over honor, love over legend. The choice, when framed that way, was no choice at all. "I'll need to pack my paints," she said. His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I would expect nothing less." They left Silver Ridge 3 days later, when Thomas was strong enough to ride. Eleanor sent her best paintings to her sister in Boston, along with a letter that explained nothing and everything. She kept only the portraits of Thomas and the Apache, the visual record of a world that was ending and beginning simultaneously. They rode north through winter landscapes, Benjamin scouting ahead, finding the safe paths. Sometimes they were 3. Sometimes they joined with others making the same journey, displaced peoples seeking new territories of the heart. Eleanor painted their stories when they stopped, creating a record of the in-between people, the ones who chose adaptation over annihilation. And at night, when they made camp under stars brilliant with cold, Thomas would tell her stories, not the old tales of war and glory, but new ones they were creating together. Stories of survival and transformation, of love that bridged worlds, of morning stars that guided travelers to undiscovered countries. The starstone grew warm against her chest, no longer a weight but a talisman, and Eleanor understood at last that some journeys had no clear destination, some stories no neat ending. There was only the traveling itself, the choice to keep moving forward, and the hand that held yours through the darkness, promising that dawn would come again. The Montana Territory in winter was a world painted in shades of white and gray, where the horizon blurred between land and sky. They had been traveling for 2 weeks since leaving Silver Ridge, their small party now grown to include others seeking the same undefined freedom. There was Clara Barton, not the famous nurse, but a former schoolteacher who'd married a Mexican vaquero and her husband Miguel. There was Joseph Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant who'd lost his newspaper in a fire and decided to start fresh where names meant nothing. Each carried their own story of displacement, their own reasons for choosing the margins. They made camp that night in a grove of cottonwoods, the bare branches offering little shelter from the wind but breaking its worst fury. Thomas moved stiffly as he gathered firewood, his wounds still protesting the constant travel. Eleanor watched him with concern that had become habitual, reading pain in the set of his shoulders, exhaustion in the careful way he bent to pick up each branch. "You're pushing too hard," she said when he returned to the fire. "We need to reach the trading post before the next storm." He set down the wood, avoiding her eyes. Mackenzie said it was only 2 more days north. Alexander Mackenzie. Their latest addition was a Scots-Canadian trader who knew the borderlands like the lines on his weathered palms. He'd taken one look at their mixed group and laughed. "Aye, you'll fit right in where we're going. Nothing but misfits and marriages that would scandalize proper society." Now, Eleanor pressed closer to Thomas, feeling the tremor in his body that he tried to hide. "The storm can wait. You can't." "I'm fine." "You're lying." She turned to face him fully. "And badly. You forget I've seen you actually fine. This isn't it." Benjamin materialized from the darkness, as silent as always. The weeks of travel had changed him too, from grieving boy to watchful protector. "She's right. You need rest, real rest, not just a few hours between riding." Thomas's jaw tightened, the war chief struggling with the invalid. "We're too exposed here, too close to—" "To nothing," Clara interrupted from across the fire. She was a small woman with large opinions, unafraid to voice them. "We haven't seen another soul in 3 days. The only thing hunting us now is your own stubborn pride." "Clara," Miguel warned softly, but she waved him off. "No, someone needs to say it. We're all running from something, but we can't run ourselves to death." She looked at Thomas directly. "You saved your people, saved as many as you could. Dying now from exhaustion won't make the ones you lost any less dead." The brutal honesty of it made everyone flinch. Thomas's face went rigid, then crumbled at the edges. Eleanor reached for him, but he stood abruptly, walking away from the fire into the darkness. "I'll go," Benjamin said, but Eleanor was already rising. "No, this is my conversation to have." She found him by the frozen stream, staring at the ice as if it held answers. The moonlight turned everything silver, including the tears on his face that he didn't try to hide. "She's right," he said without turning. They're dead whether I live or die, but living feels like betrayal. Eleanor moved to stand beside him. Because you think suffering honors them. Because I led them to trust. I spoke pretty words about peace and cooperation, and they believed me. His voice was raw. 43 people. Eleanor, I can name them all. Little Sparrow, who was learning to weave. Running Deer, who told the best stories. Children who... He stopped, unable to continue. And how many lived because of your leadership? How many found safety because you held the line? Eleanor took his hand, feeling how cold it had become. Benjamin told me the count. Over 100 escaped because of what you did. It's not enough. It's never enough. That's the terrible arithmetic of survival. She squeezed his hand. But those 100 people are alive tonight. Their children will grow up to tell stories, not just of loss, but of the chief who chose to save lives rather than take them. Thomas finally looked at her. Sometimes I think you see a man who doesn't exist, some noble version of me that... I see you, Eleanor interrupted. Flawed, grieving, stubborn you. And I love exactly who you are, not who you think you should be. They stood in silence, the stream making small sounds beneath its ice. Finally, Thomas pulled her against him, resting his chin on her head. How do you do it? He asked. How do you keep believing in tomorrow? Because I've seen what happens when people stop believing. They become ghosts before their time. She tilted her face up to his. I won't let you become a ghost. Thomas, not while I have breath to argue with you. Something shifted in his expression, a tiny crack in the wall of guilt he'd built. You would argue with the wind itself. If the wind was being stupid, yes. He almost smiled. Almost. It was enough. They returned to find the camp reorganized. Mackenzie had arrived from his scouting, bringing news and a decision. There's an abandoned trading post a day's ride west, he announced. Good buildings, water source that doesn't freeze. We could winter there, rest up proper before the final push to Canada. Abandoned why? Joseph asked suspiciously. The journalist in him always questioned good fortune. Owner died last spring. No heirs. Local tribes avoid it, say it's bad medicine on account of the death. But I knew old Morrison. He died in his sleep at 70. If that's bad medicine, I'll take it. The group looked to Thomas, still acknowledging him as leader despite his attempts to abdicate. He glanced at Eleanor, saw her silent plea, and nodded. We winter there, rest and resupply before spring travel. The relief around the fire was palpable. They'd all been pushing hard, driven by fear and necessity. The promise of walls and roofs, of time to simply exist without running, was precious beyond measure. The trading post, when they reached it, was better than promised. A main building of solid logs, several outbuildings, a corral for the horses. It sat in a valley protected from the worst winds, with a stream running clear and cold nearby. Mackenzie was right, it was perfect. They settled in with an efficiency born of necessity. Clara took charge of organizing the living spaces, her teaching background making her a natural coordinator. Miguel and Joseph worked on securing the buildings, checking for damage and patching what needed fixing. Benjamin hunted, keeping them supplied with fresh meat. And Eleanor set up a makeshift studio in what had been the storeroom, finally able to unpack her paints properly for the first time in weeks. The light was good through the single window. And she lost herself in capturing their strange new life, Clara teaching Miguel to read by firelight, Joseph writing in his journal with ink that kept threatening to freeze, Mackenzie mending harnesses while humming Scottish ballads. But mostly, she painted Thomas. Not the broken war chief or the guilty survivor, but the man who was slowly emerging from both, who helped Joseph repair the roof despite his healing wounds, who listened to Mackenzie's stories with genuine interest, who was learning to smile again in small, precious moments. It was during a December blizzard, the wind howling like all the spirits of the prairie, that Thomas finally told the whole story. They were gathered in the main room, the fire blazing. Everyone engaged in their own tasks, but listening as his voice wove through the storm sounds. He told of the massacre in detail he'd spared them before the confusion. The screaming, the impossible choices made in seconds. He named the dead, giving each a moment of remembrance. He spoke of the weight of leadership, the certainty that different decisions might have saved more lives. "But that's the trap," Joseph said when Thomas paused. "Believing we can control outcomes through perfect choices. I've covered enough tragedies to know sometimes there are no good options, only less terrible ones. The Apache way is to accept what is," Thomas said slowly. "But accepting feels like forgetting." "No," Clara's voice was firm. "Accepting means carrying them forward, not leaving them behind. Every choice you make now honors or dishonors their memory." Over the following weeks, something shifted in the trading post. It became less a way station and more a home. Clara started a small school, teaching letters to anyone who wanted to learn. Joseph began documenting their stories, creating a record of the between people. Miguel and Mackenzie established trade with the scattered settlers and native bands, careful networks of trust and mutual benefit. And Thomas began to heal, not just his body, though that too Eleanor watched the gray leave his face. The strength returned to his movements, but his spirit, so long crushed by guilt, began to unfurl like a plant finding sunlight. It happened in small ways. The first time he really laughed at one of Mackenzie's bawdy stories. The day he picked up Benjamin's guitar and played songs he'd learned as a child. His voice rusty but true. The night he danced with Eleanor to no music but the wind, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a spinning world. "You're different," she told him one morning, finding him watching the sunrise from the porch. "I'm learning to be," he admitted. "It's harder than war. This living with ghosts, but not for them." What changed? He considered the question, his profile sharp against the winter light. "You did, all of you. You show me every day that broken people can build something new, that choosing life isn't betrayal, it's the only real rebellion against death." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her automatically. "So, what do we build?" "Thomas, what does our rebellion look like?" "I don't know yet, but for the first time I want to find out." Spring came slowly to Montana, the snow retreating in patches to reveal the earth beneath. With it came decisions. Some of their group were ready to continue north. Joseph had connections in Winnipeg. Mackenzie knew traders across the border. But others were beginning to wonder if they'd already found what they were seeking. It was Clara who voiced it first. "What if we stayed, built something real here?" They were gathered for dinner, the evening light golden through the windows. The suggestion hung in the air like a held breath. "The post is unclaimed," Miguel pointed out. "We could file papers, make it legal." "A town of misfits," Joseph mused. "There's a certain poetry to it." They talked late into the night, painting possibilities with words. A place where mixed marriages weren't scandals but normal, where Apache and Mexican and immigrant could trade and live without the weight of other people's hate, where children could learn all their languages, honor all their heritages. "It's a dream," Thomas said finally. "Dreams have a way of dying in daylight." "So do people who stop dreaming," Eleanor countered. "We've already done the impossible, survived together. Why not try for improbable instead?" In the end, it was Benjamin who settled it. "I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. If we're going to make a stand somewhere, why not here?" They spent the next days in planning. Joseph would handle the legal aspects. His journalism connections still worth something. Mackenzie would expand the trading networks. Clara would formalize the school. Miguel would manage the horses and livestock they'd acquire. "And Thomas, you're the leader," Eleanor said when he protested he had no role. "Whether you want it or not, people look to you." "I led people to disaster once." "No, you led them through disaster. There's a difference." She touched his face, tracing the new lines there. "Lead them to something better now." It wasn't easy. There were conflicts, personality clashes, resource disputes, the thousand small negotiations required to build community from scratch. There were threats from outside suspicious sheriffs, hostile neighbors, the constant risk of exposure and expulsion. But there were victories, too. The first successful harvest from Clara's garden, the day a passing wagon train stopped to trade and left spreading word of a place where fair dealing was the rule. The night Thomas stood before them all and spoke of the future without mentioning the past, his voice strong with purpose, renewed. Eleanor painted it all, creating a visual history of their experiment. Her work began to sell, sent through Mackenzie's networks to collectors back east who were fascinated by her authentic frontier subjects. She didn't tell them how authentic. That the Apache warrior in her portraits shared her bed. That the Mexican children playing in the dust were learning Shakespeare alongside their native songs. It was late summer when the test came. A band of Apache, survivors from various massacres, arrived seeking Thomas. They'd heard rumors of a chief who'd found a new way, who lived with whites without surrendering his spirit. "Come with us," their leader urged. "We're gathering in the mountains. When we're strong enough, we'll fight again." Thomas listened respectfully, then shook his head. "I've fought. I've lost people to that fight. Now I try something different." "You've become white." "No, I've become myself." Thomas gestured to the trading post, the gardens, the children of various colors playing together. "This is what I build now, not victory over enemies, but a place where enemies become neighbors." Some stayed, others left, disappointed or disgusted, but word spread of a place where the old ways met the new without either being destroyed, where a man could be fully himself regardless of what that self contained. By autumn, their settlement had grown to 30 souls. They held a feast to celebrate the harvest, everyone contributing dishes from their heritage. Eleanor watched Thomas moving through the crowd, mediating disputes, encouraging the shy, being the leader he'd never wanted to be but was born for. "No regrets?" Benjamin asked, joining her observation. Eleanor touched the starstone at her throat, thinking of all the paths not taken. "How can I regret the road that brought me here?" That night, as the celebration wound down, Thomas found her on the porch, painting the last light of day. "You were right," he said simply. "About what?" "Everything. Living is harder than dying. But it's also—" He searched for words. "More. Just more." Eleanor set down her brush and moved into his arms. "So, we keep building. We keep building, day by day, soul by soul." He kissed her forehead. "And maybe someday, what we build will be strong enough to last." "It already is," Eleanor said. "Look around. Thomas, we're not between worlds anymore. We've made a new world, right here in the margins." He held her as the stars emerged, the morning star brightest among them. And Eleanor knew that some journeys ended not with arrival at a destination, but with the realization that you'd been home all along, carried in the hearts of those who traveled with you. The trading post stood solid against the Montana sky, smoke rising from multiple chimneys now, laughter spilling from lit windows. It wasn't the ending anyone had imagined when they'd started their separate flights, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. More than enough, it was everything. The first snow of winter came early that year, dusting the Montana settlement with a fine white powder that made everything look new. Eleanor stood at the window of what had become their home, a modest addition to the trading post that Thomas had built with his own hands, helped by the growing community. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching him work with Benjamin and the other men to reinforce the barn roof before the heavier snows arrived. 5 months had passed since they'd decided to stay, to build rather than run. 5 months of small victories and smaller defeats, of learning to be a community rather than a collection of refugees. The settlement had no official name. Mackenzie called it Haven. Clara preferred Harmony. The children had taken to calling it simply home. but to the outside world, when forced to give it a designation on maps and mail routes. Thomas had registered it as Meridian, the place where lines meet. Eleanor turned from the window at the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the frost-patterned glass, she saw a lone rider pushing hard through the snow. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle propped by the door. Old habits died hard on the frontier, but relaxed when she recognized the figure. It was Harriet Tubman, not the famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, but a freed woman who'd taken the name in honor and served as their connection to the railroad towns. "Letter from Fort Benton," Harriet announced, dismounting with urgency. "And news, bad news." The main room filled quickly as word spread. Thomas came in from the barn, sawdust in his hair, his face grave as he took the official-looking envelope. Eleanor watched his expression darken as he read. "The federal government has passed new legislation," he said finally. "The Indian Restriction Act. All Apache must report to designated reservations by spring or be considered hostile." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the Apache members of their community. Any white person found harboring or aiding on-reservation Apache faces prison. The silence was heavy as wet wool. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with winter. "They can't," Clara said finally. "This is private property. We have legal—" "Legal doesn't matter when fear drives law," Joseph interrupted, his journalist's cynicism showing. "I've seen this before. They'll find ways to make it stick." "So we run again." Miguel's voice was bitter. "Always running, never standing." "Or we fight," Benjamin said quietly. The young man had grown harder over the months, his gentleness calcifying into something more dangerous. "No." Thomas's voice cut through the rising tension. "Fighting gives them excuse to destroy everything we've built. Running abandons it to decay." He set down the letter. "There's another way." Eleanor knew that tone, the sound of Thomas thinking beyond the obvious. "What are you planning?" "Transformation," he said simply. "If Apache can't exist freely, then we stop being Apache." The room erupted in protests, but Thomas held up his hand. "Hear me out. Names have power, but they're also cages. What if we chose new names, new identities, not to hide who we are, but to become who we choose to be?" "You're talking about erasure," one of the Apache men said angrily. "I'm talking about survival with dignity," Thomas countered. "We keep our stories, our languages, our ways, but privately, publicly. We become what we need to be to protect what we've built." It was a brutal calculus, and Eleanor watched the community wrestle with it over the following days. Some left, unwilling to compromise identity for safety. She didn't blame them, but others stayed, understanding that sometimes preservation required adaptation. Thomas led by example. In the legal documents Joseph prepared, he became Thomas Jefferson Pierce, taking Eleanor's chosen surname from their first meeting, making their union official in the eyes of law, if not ceremony. Others followed suit, choosing names that honored their journey while protecting their future. Eleanor documented it all in her paintings, knowing she was capturing a moment of profound transformation, not conquest, but something more complex, a people choosing to hide in plain sight rather than disappear entirely. It was during this time of change that Thomas came to her with an unexpected proposal. They were alone in their quarters, the fire burning low, when he knelt beside her chair. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not for law or protection, but because I want the world to know, whatever world we're building, that you are my choice and I am yours." Eleanor's hand went to the starstone at her throat. "Thomas, I know what I said before, that I couldn't love you. That was fear speaking." He took her paint-stained hands in his. "I'm done with fear. Eleanor, I want hope instead. Will you give me that?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." They were married on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Mackenzie performed the ceremony, using words cobbled together from various traditions. Clara sang. Benjamin played guitar. The children threw dried flowers saved from summer. It was makeshift and perfect, like everything in their small community. But even joy was shadowed by necessity. The very next day, a federal marshal arrived to inspect the settlement. Word of their mixed community had spread, and suspicions with it. Marshal Wyatt Earp, younger cousin to the famous lawman, was not what they expected. Young, thoughtful, with eyes that saw more than his easy manner suggested. He spent 3 days among them, ostensibly checking compliance with the new laws, but actually observing their experiment with genuine curiosity. "You've built something interesting here," he told Thomas and Eleanor privately before leaving. "Can't say I understand it fully, but I can see it works." "Will you report us?" Eleanor asked directly. Earp considered this. "Report what I see American citizens living peacefully, farming legally claimed land. The fact that some of them have sun-darkened skin and speak with accents." He shrugged. "Half of Montana fits that description." He left them with a warning wrapped in hope. "Keep your heads down, draw no attention, and maybe, just maybe, you'll outlast the fear." They took his advice to heart. The settlement turned inward, becoming self-sufficient where possible. Eleanor's paintings became their primary source of outside income, sold through Mackenzie's networks to collectors who appreciated romantic frontier scenes without knowing how real they were. Spring brought new challenges. The Apache who'd taken Christian names struggled with the daily deception. Some nights, Eleanor would find Thomas standing outside, chanting in whispers to stars that didn't care what name he wore. She'd join him silently, understanding that some parts of self couldn't be erased, only hidden. It was during this difficult season that Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The discovery came with terror and joy. In equal measure, what world were they bringing a child into? What heritage could they offer when heritage itself had become dangerous? She told Thomas at dawn, when the morning star was bright above the horizon. His reaction was immediate and overwhelming joy, fear, fierce protectiveness, and something else, wonder. "A child," he breathed. "Our child. Apache and white and everything in between." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear it. "Happy?" He pulled her close. "I'm terrified, overjoyed, grateful." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd have this chance, after everything lost, to create new life." The pregnancy became the settlement's shared joy. Clara immediately began planning education. Joseph started writing down stories from various traditions, a library for the next generation. Even Benjamin, usually so serious, carved toys with patient hands. But Thomas struggled. Eleanor could see it in quiet moments, the weight of bringing a child into uncertainty, the fear of failing another generation. His protective instincts, always strong, became almost overwhelming. It came to a head one evening when Eleanor found him building yet another addition to their home, a hidden room, he admitted, in case they needed to hide. "Thomas, stop!" She took the hammer from his hands. "You can't build walls against every possible future." "I can try." "No, you're so busy preparing for disaster, you're missing the miracle." She placed his hand on her growing belly. "This child needs a father who believes in tomorrow, not one who only prepares for catastrophe." He broke then, months of suppressed fear pouring out. Fear of failing their child as he believed he'd failed his people. Fear of the violence that seemed to follow him. Fear of happiness itself, as if joy were just another trap. Eleanor held him through it, this warrior who'd faced armies but was undone by impending fatherhood. When the storm passed, they sat together in the half-built room, surrounded by sawdust and possibility. "I want to teach them everything," Thomas said finally. "Apache ways and white ways and all the ways we're discovering. But what if—" "We'll figure it out together," Eleanor interrupted. "Step by step, mistake by mistake, just like everything else we've built." The baby came with the autumn harvest, After a labor that seemed to last forever and pass in an instant, a daughter, with Thomas's dark hair and Eleanor's stubborn chin. They named her Dawn for new beginnings, for the morning star, for hope itself. The settlement celebrated with a feast that lasted 3 days. Gifts came from unexpected sources. Apache women who'd hidden their identities sent traditional cradle boards. White neighbors who'd been suspicious offered practical help. Even Marshal Earp sent a letter of congratulation and a small silver spoon. But it was Thomas's transformation that moved Eleanor most. The man who'd once said he couldn't love held his daughter like she was made of spun starlight and steel. He sang to her in Apache when they were alone, whispered stories of her heritage, promised her a world better than the one he'd known. "She's perfect," he told Eleanor one night. Dawn sleeping between them. "She's loud, demanding, and keeps us from sleeping," Eleanor corrected with exhausted affection. "Perfect," Thomas repeated, like her mother. They were building routines around their new reality when the letter arrived that changed everything. It was addressed to Eleanor, bearing a Boston postmark and her sister's handwriting, but the contents were from her father. He was dying. The letter said, "Lung disease. The doctors gave him months at most. He wanted to see his daughter before the end, and more he wanted to make amends." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before showing Thomas. His face was carefully neutral as he absorbed the words. "You should go," he said finally. "Thomas, he's your father. Whatever else, that bond deserves closure." He touched Dawn's sleeping head. "And she should know where part of her comes from. Come with me." The request hung between them. Boston, the heart of Eastern society. Everything they'd run from, everything that would never accept them. "You know I can't," Thomas said gently. "Not there. Not as your husband." "Then I won't go." "Eleanor," his voice was firm, "you'll regret that forever. Go. Take Dawn. Show your father what his stubborn daughter has built." A smile touched his lips. "Then come home." The decision tore at Eleanor, but she knew he was right. Some circles needed closing. Some bridges, once burned, needed at least an attempt at repair. She left on a crisp November morning. Dawn bundled against her chest, Joseph accompanying her as far as the railroad. Thomas stood watching until they were out of sight, a figure carved from loneliness and love. The journey east was a reverse of her flight west each mile, taking her closer to a past she'd thought escaped. But Eleanor was different now. She carried Dawn like armor, this perfect proof that love could transcend boundaries. Boston hadn't changed, but Eleanor's eyes had. The grand houses seemed like prisons, the social rituals like elaborate plays. She stood on her father's doorstep, daughter in her arms, and rang the bell like any visitor. The man who answered wasn't the titan of her memory. Illness had worn him down, revealing the mortal frame beneath. His eyes went wide seeing her, wider still seeing Dawn. "Eleanor," just her name, waited with years of silence. "Father." They sat in his study, the same room where he'd raged against her leaving. He held Dawn with shaking hands, wonder overcoming propriety as she grabbed at his finger with infant determination. "She's beautiful," he said finally. "Her father is the best man I've ever known." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. Apache, warrior, leader, father, husband. She expected anger, disgust. Instead, his weathered face crumpled. "I drove you to the frontier, my pride, my stupidity." "You gave me the courage to leave," Eleanor corrected. "Without that push, I'd never have found my life." They talked through the afternoon carefully at first, then with growing honesty. He told her of regrets, of years spent building empires while his family became strangers. She told him of the settlement, of lives built in the margins, of love that transcended expectation. "I want to leave her something," he said as evening approached, gesturing to Dawn. "Money, land, whatever will help. Leave her your blessing." Eleanor said, "That's worth more than gold." He gave both, in the end, legal documents ensuring Dawn's inheritance, but more importantly, a letter acknowledging her as his granddaughter, regardless of her heritage. It was a gift Eleanor hadn't expected acceptance, however late. She stayed 2 weeks, introducing Dawn to her Aunt Charlotte, visiting her mother's grave, closing chapters that had been left ragged. But her heart pulled west with each passing day, toward Thomas and the life they'd built. The return journey felt like coming home with each mile. When the mountains appeared on the horizon, Eleanor could have wept. When she saw Thomas waiting at the stage stop, she did. He caught them both in arms that shook with relief. "You came back. Did you doubt? Every hour?" He kissed her fiercely, then gentle kissed Dawn's head. "How was it?" "Healing," Eleanor said, "and finished. That life is truly done now." They returned to Meridian to find it thriving. New families had arrived, drawn by word of a place where difference was normal. The school had expanded. The trading post bustled with legitimate commerce. That night, as snow began to fall, Eleanor and Thomas stood watching their daughter sleep. The star stone lay on the dresser. Eleanor had removed it finally. Its purpose served. She didn't need talismans anymore. She had reality. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, echoing Benjamin's question from months before. Eleanor thought of Boston's comforts, of the life she could have led. Then she looked at Thomas, at Dawn, at the snow falling on their small but real kingdom. "How can I regret the road that brought me home?" He smiled, and in that smile was every dawn they'd watched together, every sunset yet to come. Outside, the morning star rose over Montana mountains, blessing the margin dwellers who'd found their center at last. 10 years had passed since Eleanor first rode into the Arizona desert seeking freedom and found instead a love that redefined her world. Now, standing on the porch of their Montana home, she watched Dawn play with the other children, a beautiful mixture of heritages and hopes, running free under the big sky. The settlement of Meridian had grown to nearly 200 souls, each with their own story of transformation, each contributing to the tapestry of their unusual community. Thomas emerged from the schoolhouse where he'd been teaching the young men, both Apache and white, the art of tracking and reading the land. His hair showed silver now at the temples, and lines mapped years of sun and struggle on his face, but his eyes remained bright, especially when they found Eleanor across the distance. "Letter from Benjamin," he said, holding up the envelope. Benjamin had left 2 years prior, drawn to the cities where he worked with other displaced peoples, helping them navigate the brutal maze of changing laws and shrinking possibilities. His letters came regularly, filled with news both hopeful and heartbreaking. Eleanor took the letter, noting the urgency in the handwriting. As she read, her expression grew grave. "The government is planning another push, forced allotments. They're calling it, breaking up tribal lands into individual holdings. Destroying community to create property," Thomas said bitterly. "They learn new ways to kill what they cannot control." But there was more. Benjamin wrote of changes coming, a new generation of reformers in Washington who spoke of preservation rather than erasure, who saw value in what others sought to destroy. He was working with them, carefully, hoping to create legal protections for communities like Meridian. "He asks if you'll come speak to them," Eleanor said. "In Washington, tell your story, our story. Show them what's possible when fear gives way to understanding." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching Dawn chase butterflies with her friends. "I swore I'd never leave this place, never again put on the mask of the tame Apache for white audiences. This would be different," Eleanor said gently. "Not performance, but truth. Not begging, but teaching." That evening, they called a community meeting. The main hall, built just 2 years ago when the trading post could no longer hold their gatherings, filled with faces that had become family. Clara and Miguel, their hair gray now, but spirits undimmed. Joseph, whose small newspaper had become the voice of the margin dwellers. Mackenzie, who'd married a Blackfoot woman and now had 3 children who spoke 4 languages, and dozens more, each carrying their piece of the whole. Thomas stood before them, still the reluctant leader who led better than anyone who sought the role. Benjamin asks us to speak for ourselves in the halls of power, to show them we exist, we thrive, we matter. He paused. I won't go without your blessing. This is your story, too. The debate was long and passionate. Some feared exposure. Others saw opportunity. It was Dawn, allowed to sit with the adults now at 10 years old, who spoke the words that decided it. If we don't tell our story, she said in her clear child's voice, others will tell it for us, and they'll get it wrong. From the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought, watching her daughter show the same stubborn courage that had driven Eleanor west all those years ago. The vote was unanimous. Thomas would go, but not alone. Eleanor would accompany him, bringing her paintings years of visual documentation that showed the truth of their experiment. Dawn would come too, living proof that the future they fought for was already here. They left in spring, when the mountain passes cleared and the world seemed full of possibility. The journey east was different this time, not flight but mission. At every stop, they saw how the country had changed. Railroad towns sprawling into cities, Indian children in boarding schools, their hair shorn and languages forbidden, the frontier closing, civilization spreading like water over sand. Washington was a shock after years in Meridian's simple honesty. The buildings seemed to compete for grandeur, each marble facade a statement of power. Benjamin met them at the station, older and wearing the careful expression of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous currents. Thank you for coming, he said, embracing them all. Your rooms are arranged. The hearing is in 3 days. What should we expect? Thomas asked. Questions, skepticism. Some will see you as curiosities, others as threats to the natural order. Benjamin's smile was sharp. Show them they're wrong about both. Eleanor spent the days before the hearing visiting galleries, observing how the East saw the West through art, romantic paintings of noble savages and brave pioneers, nothing like the complex reality she'd lived and painted. She thought of her own work, crated carefully for the exhibition Benjamin had arranged to coincide with the hearing. Would anyone see the truth she'd tried to capture? The morning of the hearing dawned gray and humid, so different from Montana's clear skies. Eleanor dressed carefully, not in Eastern fashion, but in the practical elegance she'd developed in Meridian, a style that spoke of who she'd become. Thomas wore a mixture 2 suit jacket over traditional shirt, his long hair bound with both leather and silver. Dawn they dressed simply, letting her natural grace speak for itself. The hearing room was packed, reformers and reporters, politicians and curious citizens. Eleanor recognized no allies in the sea of faces, but perhaps that would come. Thomas took his seat at the witness table with the dignity that had never left him, even in the darkest times. The committee chairman, a stern man named Cleveland claiming distant relation to the former president, called the hearing to order. Mr. Pierce, is it you claim to represent a successful integrated community in Montana? Please elaborate. And Thomas did. He spoke of Meridian not as an experiment but as reality, of Apache and white and Mexican and more, living not in mere tolerance but in true community. He spoke of children learning multiple languages not from textbooks but from neighbors, of traditions preserved through adaptation rather than museums, of the future they were building one day at a time. This is all very poetic, one committee member interrupted, but hardly practical on a larger scale. What works for a few dozen? 217, Thomas corrected, and growing. Cannot work for thousands. The races have different capacities, different destinies, different gifts. Thomas agreed, surprising them. Which is why we're stronger together than apart. Our blacksmith learned Apache metalworking techniques that improve his craft. Our Apache farmers learned irrigation methods that make the desert bloom. Each brings strength to shore up others' weaknesses. Eleanor watched the committee struggle with this concept: cooperation rather than domination, synthesis rather than separation. When her turn came to speak, she brought out her paintings one by one, not the romantic scenes she sold to collectors, but the true portraits: mixed families at dinner, integrated work crews raising barns, children playing without thought to the colors of their playmates' skin. "This is our reality," she said, "not perfect, not without conflict, but real, and growing realer every day." It was Dawn who stole the hearing. When asked to speak, she stood with poise beyond her years and recited first in English, then in Apache, then in Spanish, a poem about home, about belonging to multiple worlds without being torn apart, about being bridge rather than boundary. When she finished, the room was silent. Even the skeptics seemed moved by this child who embodied everything they'd been taught was impossible. The hearing continued for hours, questions ranging from practical to philosophical. But Eleanor could see minds opening, just cracks of light through locked doors. When they finally emerged, exhausted but intact, Benjamin was smiling. "You did it," he said. "Not convinced them all, but planted seeds. That's all we can ask." The exhibition of Eleanor's paintings opened that evening. She stood nervously as visitors filed through, watching their reactions to her 10 years of documentation. Some walked quickly past, uncomfortable with the reality depicted, but others lingered, asking questions, wanting to know more about the people in the portraits. "Is this really how you live?" a young woman asked, studying a painting of the harvest feast where Apache drums and Scottish fiddles made music together. "It's really how we live," Eleanor confirmed. "Not always easily, but always honestly." "I wish," the woman started, then stopped. "Yes, I wish the whole country could be like that. People just being people." Eleanor smiled. "Start where you are. Build what you can. The rest follows." They stayed in Washington a week, meeting with reformers, journalists, anyone who would listen. Thomas found unexpected allies, military men who'd fought Apache and come to respect them, missionaries who'd seen forced conversion fail, even politicians who'd begun to question the wisdom of cultural destruction. But it was the letter that arrived their last day that meant the most. It came from Meridian, signed by dozens of hands. "Come home," it said simply. "We miss our heart." The journey back was triumphant in a quiet way. They'd changed no laws, overturned no policies, but they'd planted seeds, as Benjamin said, shown possibilities, proved that what existed in one small Montana valley might exist elsewhere. Elsewhen. Meridian welcomed them back with a celebration that lasted days. Stories were shared, plans were made, hope renewed. The settlement continued to grow, drawn by word of mouth and desperate hearts. Not utopia, Thomas was quick to correct that notion, but a place where people could become themselves without losing themselves. Eleanor returned to her painting with renewed purpose, documenting not just their community, but the others they learned about similar experiments in coexistence scattered across the country like stars in darkness. She began teaching too, passing on techniques to Dawn and the other children, ensuring the stories would continue in color and line, even after words failed. Thomas threw himself into building both structures and systems, a council that represented all groups, trade networks that connected margin communities across vast distances, education that honored all traditions while preparing children for whatever future they chose. And Dawn grew, embodying everything they'd hoped, fluent in cultures, comfortable in her mixed skin. She moved between worlds with grace her parents had fought to achieve. When she announced at 15 her intention to study law to protect what we've built with paper as well as paint, Eleanor saw the future taking shape. The years passed with their mixture of joy and sorrow. They lost friends Mackenzie to age, others to the persistent dangers of frontier life. They gained new members, refugees from various forms of intolerance. The settlement evolved, faced challenges, adapted, endured. It was on their 20th anniversary that Thomas took Eleanor back to Arizona, a journey she'd never thought to make. They stood at the sacred pool where they'd truly met, both grayer now, marked by years, but still recognizing in each other the spark that had started it all. "Do you remember?" Thomas said, "when I told you I couldn't love you?" "Vividly," Eleanor laughed. "You were very convincing." I was terrified. He pulled her close. "Not of you, of what you represented. Hope, future, everything I'd convinced myself I couldn't have. And now I know the truth. Love isn't weakness or strength. It's transformation. It makes us more than ourselves alone." He kissed her softly. "You taught me that." They returned to Meridian to find Dawn preparing for her own journey east to law school, to fight for communities like theirs in courts and Congress. Watching her pack, Eleanor felt the echo of her own younger self, heading into the unknown with more courage than sense. "Scared?" she asked her daughter. "Terrified," Dawn admitted. "But you taught me something. Fear just means you're about to grow." The morning Dawn left, the whole community gathered to see her off. She carried with her letters of introduction, samples of Eleanor's paintings, and, most importantly, the living proof of what she was, child of two worlds who belonged fully to both. "She'll change things," Thomas said as they watched the stage disappear. "She already has," Eleanor replied, "just by existing." That evening, as they'd done thousands of times before, Eleanor and Thomas sat watching the sunset paint the mountains. The starstone, long retired from wearing, caught the light from its place on the mantel. Around them, the sounds of Meridian children playing in multiple languages, dinner preparations mixing cultural aromas, someone tuning a guitar for evening music. "Was it worth it?" Eleanor asked. "Everything we gave up, everything we fought for." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured to their community, their home, their life. "I once thought strength meant standing alone. You taught me it meant standing together. I thought preserving culture meant keeping it frozen. You showed me it could grow and change and still remain true." He took her paint-stained hand. "Was it worth it, my love? It was everything." The morning star rose as they sat together, constant as the love that had survived distance, prejudice, and time itself. Eleanor thought of the young woman who'd fled west seeking freedom, of the warrior who'd said he couldn't love, of all the transformations that had brought them here. Some stories, she realized, didn't end, they just kept becoming, generation by generation, heart by heart, and somewhere out there, Dawn carried their story forward, adding her own chapters to the endless tale of people finding each other across impossible divides and choosing to build bridges from the wreckage of walls. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, but below them, in one small corner of Montana, love had carved out space for impossibility to take root and bloom. And that, Eleanor thought as Thomas drew her closer, was miracle enough for any lifetime. In Meridian, the margin that had become a center, life went on and on and on. Thank you so much for listening to this story of I Can't Love You. The Apache said until she walked away and took his heart with her. I hope Eleanor and Thomas's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts about their story and connect with fellow fans of these tales from the Old West. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Hit that like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover these powerful stories of love and courage in the American frontier. Until next time, keep riding toward your own horizons.